Hey there. Welcome back. We got some really important literature to discuss tonight. I'm talking one of the most important books ever written, ever. But before we do, I want to clear up a little bit of business. I want to take care of some clarifications pertaining to what I said in the last broadcast. We were discussing American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, and I stated in that broadcast that there was never a sequel made. You've got to understand, I was talking about the book. There was a sequel made to the film, as many of you horror fans know, but honestly, I would not recommend it. It was horrible. For one thing, they killed off Patrick Bateman in the opening. And honestly, I don't think they even used Christian Bale. I think they just got somebody that was of his approximate height and weight and slapped a 1980s wig on him and sent him out there to die. The character gets killed by one of his own victims. That's totally ridiculous. I looked for his name in the credits and didn't see it, and he's not listed in the filmography. I think this is one of those cases going back to, for example, Daughter of Dracula. For years, I would watch the film Daughter of Dracula and wondered why they didn't use Bela Lugosi in the promotion for the picture. I wondered why he never appeared in the credits. Were they trying to do a mysterious Bride of Frankenstein thing where they don't tell you who the monster is? But no, I later did some research and found out that what they didn't want to pay Bela Lugosi. They didn't have the money to do it. It was a low-budget horror film. So they just took a wax dummy. I am not making this up. And created it to look like Bela Lugosi, dumped it in a coffin. Dracula's only in the scene for the opening, and voila, there's your Dracula. So I think that was what they did with the American Psycho sequel. The story then picks up using a female serial killer who is basically not believable as a killer at all. She's very physically unassuming, doesn't have the physical power to pull off these brutal murders that are trying to live up to the original and don't. I think William Shatner makes an appearance at some point. I don't see it. You'll want those 2 hours of your life back. We could only all live again. But without further ado, let's talk about the real reason that we're here tonight. One of the most important novels ever written, not just within the genre of horror, but within all of English literature. And I am talking about Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And I will also discuss a good portion of all the various films that followed this groundbreaking novel. I don't think people fully realize the impact and the importance of Frankenstein. You see, it was three things of colossal importance. It was the very first science fiction novel. Predates Jules Verne, predates anything in that realm. Number two, and this is kind of a controversial claim, but I'll be controversial because I can back up the claim. Number two, it was the first horror novel. I know a lot of people will, who are scholars, will argue, and there is some debate about this. There are a lot of scholars who debate that The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole was, in fact, the first horror novel. It was not. It's an obscure book. It's not very good. It is actually of a classifiable genre that you can put your finger on that's not horror. prior to horror, there was something called the Gothic novel. Okay, these were medieval settings. They were written largely in the 17th, 18th centuries, 19th century also maybe dragged on. Uh, they were, if you've ever read Ivanhoe, they're closer to that than they are to Frankenstein or Dracula or anything you would consider to be early horror. This is what the Castle of Otranto is. It has none of the scares that Frankenstein has none of the horror for horror's sake. You looking through those pages, I think that if somebody from modern horror, a character from modern horror, for example, Patrick Bateman would have one of Walpole's characters duct taped and tied to a chair in minutes, and then would likely have his guts on the floor. He would gut him like a fish, because it's not horror. You gotta have real violence if you're gonna have a horror novel. And this is why I will insist, and insist correctly, that Frankenstein was in fact the first horror novel. Mary Shelley wrote it very quickly. She was a teen when she wrote it, in her 20s when it was finally published and made it big, so to speak. It is, as you know, the story of a mad scientist who decides that he is going to create life from inanimate body parts. He pillages local cemeteries, sews the parts together, and uses electricity to bring his monstrous creation to life. The monster in the novel is nothing like any of the film versions except for one, which I'll get to. It's 13 feet in height. The radiation from this massive electric influx warps the physical structure of these human body parts and basically causes them to mutate into this massive creature. This guy is 13 feet tall. His skin is translucent yellow, is how it's described in the book. I don't know why people always claim that there's not a lot of detail about the monster. The monster is described in intimate detail in numerous places throughout the book. It's you can literally see through the skin to his organs. Okay, the skin's yellow, but you can see through because it's been stretched. It's the skin of a normal-sized man stretched into this 13-foot high freak, and the muscles are all blown out of disproportion. The limbs are not proportionate. It's truly incredibly frightening. The physicality of the monster alone is a reason to read the book. A lot of people don't like it because it's written in a 19th century style. It's actually written in what is known as the frame story, okay, which you'll also see in Dracula. A character comes in, he writes either a journal or a series of letters, and that's his telling of the story. And then in the next frame, you get somebody else's take on the same story. You actually hear from the monster in the book. He tells you what happened to him. You get back and forth with other letters. So, and then when they're put all together, they make a story. The framework stuck together makes Frankenstein, the novel. I don't really mind it at all. I really find it fascinating way different characters will look at different things. But some people struggle with it because of that. I think that's why it lay dormant, no pun intended, for many, many years. This came out in the early 19th century. It was not really a blockbuster. Mary Shelley went on to write, largely historical romances and things of that nature. This was her only foray into horror that I know of. And she, her main claim to fame was being the wife of the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, who, was the towering character in romantic literature. He was a poet. So it really didn't capture public attention too well when it first came out. It was made into a silent film in the early silent film era, which was okay, but it did not follow the book. And then, of course, it was made into the colossal, iconic Universal Studios Boris Karloff Frankenstein, which is what everybody knows. And Boris Karloff was awesome. I'm a big fan of that movie and of him and his career. But it does not follow the book. The monster looks absolutely nothing like the monster from the book. It's not as terrifying, if you can imagine that. I first, though, want to examine why this book is so important. It's a philosophical piece. It makes you think. It shows this scientist. He's not a professor. He's actually a student, which is also very telling. Yeah, Mary Shelley portrays this guy as being very young. He's inexperienced, doesn't know what he's doing. It's a metaphor for mankind in general. And then he comes forward, creates a bunch of experiments in which various pieces are brought to life before finally making the monster. I knew that it would not be easy to translate this into a movie. So Universal Studios did the best with what they had in the 1930s. This is the Depression era. There's no CGI. But it really left out a lot of this heavy-handed philosophy about man playing God, about metaphor for parenthood. There's a direct scene in which the monster turns to his creator and says, "Lest I be thine Adam." And this created the false notion that has lasted to this day that the monster's name was Adam. No, it's a metaphor for the first man. It's a comparison to the creation story in Genesis. It was perpetuated by Marvel Comics in the comic version, where they actually present the monster as being named Adam, which ingrained it into the public mind with all these children reading this tale and absorbing this false notion that the monster is named Adam. The monster has no name. The monster's name is not Frankenstein. Frankenstein is the name of its creator. That was also perpetuated by Universal Studios in the sequels, in which you've got, Dracula meets Frankenstein, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, and they're calling the monster Frankenstein, and it's not. So that's another problem I have with Hollywood getting involved with literature. However, the mistakes are great. They're almost better. I enjoyed every minute of it. I love all these different takes and culture on these stories. And the original novel gets very heavy-handed in terms of its ending. There's a kind of a spoiler alert here if you're one of the two people left on Earth who doesn't know how Frankenstein ends. In the book, Frankenstein is chased by his monster to the North Pole. North Pole is also a metaphor for science because people were trying to reach it at the time, and nature that is stronger than human beings. The monster ultimately kills Frankenstein on the deck of his ship, maybe, and then floats out on a block of ice again to die, maybe. We don't. Mary Shelley never wrote a sequel, so I guess we can presume the monster died. But the last they ever see of him is this ship, guy on the ship in the North Pole. It's an icebreaker whaler. Describes how the monster floats out to sea, and that's the last that's ever seen of him. In the movie, of course, villagers chase him, they burn him in a windmill, he comes back burned, and there's a whole slew of sequels, but not so in the original book. The real attempt by Hollywood to make the book and the film compatible again was the film with Robert De Niro as the monster, entitled quite simply Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and starring Kenneth Branagh, the Shakespearean actor, as Victor Frankenstein, the monster's creator. This is the closest to the book of all the films, but it really does not do the book justice and does not follow the book. For one thing, the monster is not accurate at all. Robert De Niro is, even with the elevator shoes on him, I don't think he clears 6 foot. He's not terrifying enough. They shave his head to make him look a little freaky. We've never seen that before. But he never quite pulls off the terror that the monster has. In the book, the monster rips people to shreds with his bare hands. He doesn't even need weapons. He's almost like an atomic monster, even though the atom hasn't been split yet, because he's a result of this radioactive mutation. And is just immune to cold and can go anywhere he wants. The Robert De Niro character doesn't have any of that. And they also screw up the ending. They tell you the ending at the beginning, which is totally out of sequence with the book. They do that again in Dracula when they try to make so-called Bram Stoker's Dracula, but that's another story. The way in which the monster is brought to life is wrong. I didn't really like the laboratory. Looks cool, but it's kind of steampunk. It's not the 19th century, doctor's lab that is in the book. It's actually 18th century, because although it was from the 19th century, it's set in the 18th century. So Mary Shelley backdated it even further to give it even more, make the scientists seem even more ignorant. He quotes all these alchemists and these people that are regarded as, witch doctors of their time. So this brings us, there's a whole slew of other Frankenstein films. They're all pretty interesting. I've never seen a Frankenstein film I didn't like. I really like the Hammer Studios version, in which, of all people, Christopher Lee of Dracula fame plays the monster, and he does a pretty good job. He's a very thin, worn out, more of a zombie type. We're coming back now, type of Frankenstein monster. But it's still pretty cool, and it's, the 70s Technicolor lusciousness of Hammer Studios. But I would really like to draw your attention to a more recent film called Victor Frankenstein, which, in my opinion, has the closest to the book version of the monster. It's also not a very good film, doesn't follow the book at all. It uses the actor from Harry Potter as a sort of Igor character. He's assisting Victor Frankenstein, and they're this, steampunk whiz kids who are going to make monsters come to life. Well, they do. They use this, I think he's a British bodybuilder. They, of course, CGI him up to about the height of the real monster in the book. I don't know if he's quite that big, but he's pretty spot on. He's got the skin, the look. He also is kind of a nod to the Karloff version, which I also appreciated that they did kind of an homage to the original Frankenstein from Universal Studios. But they totally messed up the story. It's worth seeing just for the monster, especially in the closing scene. I won't give you spoilers on that if you do want to watch it. It's a relatively new film. Most people haven't seen it. It's got an ending scene in which the monster's really showcased in this obscure castle. But the way he's taken out, the usage of Harry Potter, I just didn't grab me as a film. So I'd like to wrap up by saying that if you have not, go out and read Frankenstein, study its pages. It is what all these other films were born from. It is also one of the most important novels in English literature. That's another claim I want to make, because it had so much influence, not only in terms of the way it was written in the frame story format, and not only in terms of the monsters that it created. Every zombie story, every sci-fi story, it all comes back to Frankenstein. But it also is important because it is a work of philosophy. It brings up a lot of questions about what it means to be alive and dead, why you're alive. Do you have the responsibility to bring life into the world? And most of all, don't be surprised when the lives you bring forth backfire and come to haunt you and ultimately kill you.